Hey everybody, it's Mr. Bliss. This video is about cell organelles. We're getting into some videos about cell structures, and in order to understand some of the functions that cells have to undergo, it's good to start off by looking at the differences between types of cells and the components that make cells up in order to further understand what makes them work. So, before we start, I want to introduce some types of cells. When life first began on Earth, we're not exactly sure, scientists aren't exactly sure how life started on Earth, but we are fairly certain that the first living things on Earth were organisms known as archaea or archaebacteria. And that's where that name actually comes from, archae like archaeology, old. Nowadays, archaebacteria are found mostly in extreme habitats, sulfur ponds or deep sea thermal vents under the ocean. But they gave rise to kind of all the life that we know today. You'll see that there's this branch coming off of archaea here that goes to bacteria. This is another, what we call a domain of life, bacteria. And together, these two groups make up a group that we refer to as the prokaryotes. Prokaryotes. And that word prokaryotes is interesting because if we break it down, we can see that pro means before, and karyote comes from a Greek word karyota, which actually means like a kernel, like a hard center. And so what this actually refers to is, right before karyota, it refers to the fact that they originated before cells had a hard center. And what's the hard center of a cell? It's the nucleus. So both bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus, and they also are lacking structures known as cell-bound or membrane-bound organelles. So we will see what organelles are and what they do, but I just want to keep looking at this diagram for a minute because we'll notice that bacteria branches off up here and we get a group called eukarya. And eukarya is a domain of life that we're actually very familiar with because within the group eukarya we have 4 kingdoms that we normally think of when we think about living things. So we have protists, or protista, we have fungi, we have plantae, plants, and animalia, all animals. Single-celled, multi-celled, all of them are in this group. And what that means is that all of these groups, all protists, all fungi, all plants, all animals, their cells contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So eukarya means with. So with karyota, with a nucleus. So let's take a look at some of these words here. We said a prokaryote is a cell lacking a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. A eukaryote, I'll switch it up here so we can keep them straight, is a cell with a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So when we get to unicellular and multicellular, it is interesting to note that these organisms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, can exist as a single-celled organism. And it just means that that organism is independent. It has one cell that carries out all life functions, as opposed to, for example, humans or other animals that are multicellular, which have more than one cell that makes up the organism. So in a multicelled organism, you have cells that make up tissues, and then tissues make up organs, and then organ systems, and then all of the organ systems combined make an organism. So let's start looking at what we mean by our nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Rather than giving a definition here, let's start looking at some diagrams. And I want you to start off by thinking conceptually about a cell. Here is a membrane. Okay, so if you were to zoom in on a membrane, it's made up of macromolecules, just like we were talking about previously in this unit. Right here we have phospholipids, a phospholipid bilayer, and if you were to drop these into a liquid like water, it would arrange into this structure here, just a round circle, which encloses itself. And it has these proteins. Here are proteins that allow for things to pass through them or keep them out. It's selectively permeable. So if you have structures that are within a membrane like this, they're membrane bound. And prokaryotes do not have this. Eukaryotes do, and it allows the things within a cell to do different functions. Just like the organs in a body do different functions, organelles are small organs, and they work to sustain life for the cell. So here is a city, and you'll notice that this city has a barrier that prevents things from going in and out. And this you can either liken it to a cell wall, or you can liken it to a cell membrane, which, because it has a door that allows things in and out, is like our membrane. It can open the door to allow important nutrients in or allow for waste to come out of the cell. And so you need things like raw goods to come into our city. You need things like waste products to leave. But otherwise, the cell is fairly, self-functioning. The city is self-functioning. It has, different industries, and that's how cells work as well. They have all of the functions that require them to sustain life, including power plants or manufacturing centers or whatever. And so let's start looking at the cell and start identifying the organelles that do different jobs. This right here is an animal cell. And we know that it's an animal cell because the outside layer is our cell membrane here. It's the exact same cell membrane that we were just looking at above here, but it's just scaled down. And it's selectively permeable, and it allows things in and out of the cell, and serves as a barrier to prevent against things that they don't want to come in. So also within our cell, we have our nucleus, which is kind of like the brain of the cell. You'll hear it described as, and it contains the DNA. The DNA is inside here, which is the blueprint for how the cell can function and how to produce other substances within the cell. Within the nucleus, you have this darker dot structure, which is known as the nucleolus. And the nucleolus, it has a job of manufacturing these things called ribosomes. These are ribosomes. And it's important to note that ribosomes are not membrane-bound organelles. They exist in all cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And ribosomes make proteins. That's really important. We're going to get to that later on in our unit. We're definitely going to need to know that ribosomes make proteins. So the nucleolus makes ribosomes. You can also find ribosomes. You can find ribosomes here in the cytoplasm, which is kind of like a nutrient-rich jelly that acts as kind of like the workstation of the cell. Everything exists in the cytoplasm. Or you can find them bound to this organelle here that is known as an endoplasmic reticulum. This endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes on it, so we call it a rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER, contrasted by something like this, which is a smooth ER. And so these structures are really important because they help to manufacture things within the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum is where synthesis happens of things. Rough endoplasmic reticulum is where proteins are made, and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is where lipids are made, specifically phospholipids for other areas of the cell. Let's see, what else do we have here? We have the mitochondrion. And if you have multiple of them, they're mitochondria, but this is a singular one, so it's a mitochondrion. And mitochondria are really important because they take glucose and they turn it into energy, ATP energy for the cell. And these are definitely membrane bound, but they're found in all eukaryotic cells. We also have this organelle down here that's known as the Golgi body or Golgi apparatus. And what the Golgi body does is that it takes the things that are manufactured in the endoplasmic reticulum and it wraps them around in these bubbles here that are known as vesicles. And I'm sure I spelled that wrong, but that's okay. So it wraps around the product and it transports it around the cell. It's almost like the post office of the cell. It boxes them up in these vesicles and it can send them out of the cell. It sends them right out of the cell membrane. And it's able to do that because the vesicles are actually made of the same material as the cell membrane. So it can kind of stick onto it like a bubble and then just kind of adhere and push the thing through. Let's see, what else do we have here? We also have a vacuole here. This is a vacuole. And in an animal cell, a vacuole is relatively small. A vacuole is kind of like a warehouse for storage. It stores, maybe some extra sugars or some water or something else that the cell needs. But in an animal cell, it's relatively small compared to what we will see in a plant cell. Down here, we have the lysosome. And the lysosome is almost like the custodial staff of the cell. It helps to recycle old cell parts and break things down that may be toxic for the cell. And the way that it does that is it contains a lot of digestive enzymes. You remember enzymes from when we talked about proteins. And it helps to break those things down so that they're not dangerous for the cell or can be excreted from the cell. And the last thing that I want to talk about with the animal cell is this right here. This is the centrosome, or centrioles. And the centrioles are associated with nuclear division. They're made of microtubules, which are almost like a protein skeleton for the cell. And they're really, really important for cell division. Specifically in animal cells, it helps during mitosis, but you will not see them in plant cells. So speaking of plant cells, let's scroll down here, and we'll even switch up our colors. So here's our plant cell. And the first thing that you'll notice about a plant cell is that it has a different shape than an animal cell. It's usually rectangular or square. And the reason for that is because of this structure here, which is known as a cell wall. And cell walls are made out of cellulose, a polysaccharide sugar that's really important in plants for structure. Humans can't digest cellulose. We call it fiber, which is why you find a lot of fiber in vegetables and in some fruits. Within the cell wall, you have a lot of the same structures as the animal cell. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have our cell membrane here. We have our nucleus, our nucleolus. We also have our two types of endoplasmic reticula. It's the plural of endoplasmic reticulum for manufacturing proteins and lipids. We have our ribosomes here that are making proteins. Remember that, ribosomes make proteins. We have our Golgi body. But we have a few differences as well. You'll notice that the plant cell has a very large central vacuole. And that's important because it mostly stores water. What do plants need a lot of to survive? Water. And it also aids in providing structure for the cell. The more water is in here, the more pressure it puts on the outside of the cell wall to keep it rigid. Plants also contain mitochondria, which is important. A lot of people think that because they are plants and they're photosynthetic, they don't need mitochondria, but they do. Here is a chloroplast. And a chloroplast is kind of the defining feature of a plant cell. It's what gives it its color. Usually plant cells have a lot of these. And chloroplasts are they're important for photosynthesis. It's what captures energy from the sun and converts it to glucose. When that glucose isn't used by the cell, it stores it in a different organelle that's known as an amyloplast. And an amyloplast stores starch. So we said in the last unit that when plants need to store sugar energy, they store it as starch. And this is how they store it, in these amyloplasts. So all of our starchy vegetables and plants that we like, our potatoes and rice and wheat, they have a lot of amyloplasts. Great, so those are our eukaryotic cells, which have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. But you'll notice down here there's a little structure in pink, and this is our bacterium. It's the singular of bacteria. These are our prokaryotes. And you'll notice that they're much, much, much smaller than our eukaryotic cells. And it's because they're simplified. They don't contain as many structures, especially no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. But if we zoom in, this is our bacterium. And so let's look at some of the differences. One thing that you'll see is that it has this outer layer, which is called a capsule. And these capsules are protein-rich, and they provide the structure. They allow for bacteria to kind of survive in really extreme environments. We also have another cell wall, just like plants, as well as a cell membrane, or plasma membrane, that allows things in and out. But other than that, things are pretty simplified in our bacterium. Within our capsule, we have these things called pili, which act as a way for bacteria to adhere to other bacteria and sometimes to exchange genetic information, almost like a little tube that allows things back and forth. We have some means of locomotion, or some ways to get around. This is called a flagellum. Plural is flagella. And it's a big whip that whips back and forth to allow the bacterium to move, almost similar to the flagella on a sperm cell, which allows it to swim through liquid. You will see that bacteria also contain ribosomes, okay, because ribosomes make proteins, and all living things contain proteins. And then you will see that this bacteria has some free-floating DNA, or genetic material at least. And it's in this kind of ring structure that kind of just sits in the area of the cell where the nucleus would normally be. We call that the nucleoid region because it acts like a nucleus, but it's not a full membrane structure like the nucleus is. Anyway, that's organelles. Feel free to go back and watch this video. It's important to know where these structures are and what they do in order to understand the functions that we're going to go over. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comments and I can do my best to answer them. Thanks.